Today we're pleased to have with us Steve Charleston from Luther-Northwestern Seminary. He's the director of cross-cultural studies and a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. He's an ordained priest in the Episcopal Church and is writing and teaching and speaking about indigenous theology. And so the question is, can we speak of an indigenous theology for North America? And if so, what would that be? So welcome Steve Charleston, the Indigenous Church, the Invisible Church.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me all right? Is that okay? I think I've got a little bit of a cold, and so I'm not in top form, and I hope you'll bear with me if I speak a little slower than I usually do. Sometimes I get warmed up, and I'm quite sure how quick I'll talk or what, but I'll talk. I'm going to try and do this as succinctly as I possibly can in order to give us some time that we could talk together. You could ask me questions if you want. Some of you may find the subject matter to be a little unusual maybe, or an area that you haven't given a lot of thought to. And so I do want to invite you to ask me questions. What I am doing now, what I have been doing for a number of years, is beginning to speak and to write and talk as much as I can about a Native people's Christian theology for North America. And so when I used the subject title I did for this noon forum, The Indigenous Church, the Invisible Church, what I was thinking about is not so much the content of the theology that I'm interested in and that I teach and I talk about. I'll touch on a little bit of that content, and then maybe if you find it interesting and want to know more about some highlights of what that theology really sounds like, you could ask me. But my main concern today was to get you to think with me, to share ideas with me about why it is that we have not heard very much about an indigenous Native people's Christian theology in North America. I think most of us sitting in the room are very aware of what I call a proliferation of theologies all around us. We're living really in a kind of boom time theologically. California alone probably has 500 theologies roaming around. And you know what I'm talking about. We really don't need to, we can all just kind of acknowledge it. We have certainly a tremendous theology coming from the black experience in America. We have the power of the feminist theologies that are emerging in the life of our different denominations and churches. We have liberation theology that is just flowing all over the place from Central and South America. We have gay theologies, lesbian theologies. There is a tremendous proliferation of theological thought, and yet there is very little, if anything, being said at all about a Native people's Christian theology. And I wondered if anyone had ever bothered to stop and ask themselves, I wonder why. Why is that so? Why is it that when we still talk about the American Indian or the Native Alaskan or the Eskimo people, we are still talking about a people that are largely peripheral and marginalized? If we hear about Native people, and by Native people I mean Indian or Eskimo or Native Alaskan people north of the Rio Grande, if we hear about them in a context that is not what I call a serious adult intellectual context of dialogue or discussion on issues of theological importance, not only to the life of the church, but to the life of the whole society. What we hear about Native people still is largely questions of the plight of the American Indian, and how we should all really probably feel very sad and sorry because of the statistics that we can tick off about alcoholism or teenage pregnancies or poverty on the reservations, things like that. Occasionally, a few of us who consider ourselves more liberal will hear a little bit about some of the treaty rights violations and some of the land cases that are going on in the courts. Then there are those who find that if they pick up a copy of Black Elk Speaks or Carlos Castaneda, they feel that they can begin to understand something about the old traditional ways of Native America, and there's a kind of romantic spiritualism that people get off on when they think about us. But where is the Native people's Christian theology? That's the question I want to raise, and I want to try and answer it. And in answering it, I will be giving it an answer from my own perspective, and this is in two ways. It is, for me, very much a personal answer, because it grows out of my own life experience as a man who grew up in Oklahoma in the Choctaw Nation, and also who went through seminaries and has worked in the churches in various levels and has been all over the country. I've been privileged in my short amount of time as a theologian to travel all over the United States and Canada to meet with many different types of Native people, both Christian and traditional. And so it's a very personal answers I'll be giving. I think also it is somewhat disturbing, the answers I'll give to that question, why have we not heard of this before? And some of my answers may offend some of you or may seem threatening or challenging. I hope you'll take it in the spirit that it's offered, though, in a constructive way, because I believe that we need to come to grips with this issue of the silence from the Native community. And to break through that means that we're going to have to get a little tough and break through some barriers in order to let that theology emerge and to begin to talk about it as adults in the life of our churches or in the life of the society. The answer why? I submit to you that part of the answer, if I know I don't have a lot of time, I could probably spend a long time giving you a full answer, but I tried to summarize it by saying that one of the reasons is the trivialization of the Native American experience in North America as a product of America's colonial history. The trivialization of Native people as a product of America's colonial history. Now, what do I mean by trivialization? I mean that the oppressor has, by definition, a vested interest in maintaining a very short memory, where the oppressed has a vested interest in maintaining a very long memory. And the truth of the matter is, in the United States of America, the oppressor class of Western and Northern Europeans have maintained a very short memory. They have glossed what they call American history over with a number of national mythologies designed to alleviate the burdens of guilt and shame involved with the whole colonial expansion into our homelands. And that when you then talk about Native people, what you are doing is you are challenging and threatening that wonderful pantheon of national myths that have been so carefully constructed and created by the capitalist colonial society of North America in order to protect itself and to maintain its kind of image, its self-proclaimed image in the world as being a land of religious, political, and social freedom, of justice, and of peace. When you dredge up out of the basement of American history the story of Native American people, then you turn every one of those icons upside down, and in so doing create for the United States society a tremendous embarrassment. Let me give you some examples of what I mean. What I mean is we need to trivialize Native people in this society, because if we don't, we will be in many ways undercutting all of those mythologies that we depend on to maintain a kind of affluent capitalist structure in this country. One of them is the doctrine of discovery. There's a simple one for you. When I was a young man, and many of you, when you were young men or women, were taught, without even realizing it, the doctrine of discovery. You were taught to believe that America was discovered, and how many generations of Western Americans were taught that there was a place to be discovered. What does that doctrine of discovery really do? It is a gloss for colonialism. It is a way to say that America was a vacant lot, or to use a more appropriate term that you will find in many textbooks and many things still being taught in grade schools today, that it was a virtual wilderness. That it was a wilderness. You've heard the word, a wilderness they called it. The brave new world. Not an old world, a new world. Not a world that had centuries of society, of civilization, of development, of culture going on after a millennia, of generation after generation of cultural development. No, it's a new world, brand new, an empty, vacant, new wilderness, up for grabs, finders, keepers, and losers, weepers. That's exactly what you're taught with the doctrine of discovery. Now, if you turn that upside down and you see it from my viewpoint, as a Native person, the doctrine of discovery becomes a sham. We know, for example, from historical research, that if we were to graph out by a computer analysis the number of Native people that would have inhabited North America in the year 1492, we've had various numbers thrown around. Most of the numbers are small numbers. You will find that numbers mean a lot to Western scientists when they study Native America, and they mean a lot to church bureaucrats when it comes time to make budgets. They want to say, well, how many of you are there? Oh, well, there's not very many, so you're not very important. You're trivial, aren't you? Aren't you? You're trivial, aren't you? Well, historically, we do exactly the same thing. We say, well, there weren't very many of them here anyway, even if they were here. Between 30 and 35 million Native American people inhabited North America at the time of the colonial invasions. By 1934, under the terms of the Indian Reorganization Act, a census was done in the United States alone, and there were found to be 600,000 American Indian people left alive in North America, in the United States, continental United States. Today, we are just about 1% of the total population of the United States. Now, if there were so many millions of us in North America when the Western colonialists arrived, what happened to all of us? Where did we go? You'll find scientifically that then you begin to trivialize and make excuses and say, well, smallpox. It wasn't our fault. It was smallpox that did it. Don't look at us. Don't blame us. It wasn't that bad after all, was it? The trivialization of the native experience, the trivialization of history. There are many others I could cite to you. One that I particularly tend to get overly excited about is Thanksgiving. Can you imagine a Hallmark card that would show a Gestapo agent with his arm around a Jew? Can you imagine selling a Hallmark card in a drugstore that would show a man dressed in a black suit with that skull and crossbones on his hat with his arm around a Jew and they're both smiling? Then imagine a pilgrim with his arm around a Native American and they're both smiling. The memory of the oppressor is short. The memory of the oppressed is long. I remember clearly the massacre by these same pilgrim types of people, these same Puritan types of people, the massacre of the Wampanoag, the massacre of the Pequot, the massacre of the Narragansett, the total destruction, the elimination, the eradication of the Beothuk people of Newfoundland. I remember the slaughter and the genocide that occurred that these people brought to our shores. Can you imagine a Hallmark card with a Nazi Gestapo agent smiling with his arm around a Jew? The national mythologies that we create to ease our conscience are anathema. They are obscenities in the face of justice and peace. The Founding Fathers, another national mythology. The Founding Fathers came to bring what? Religious freedom, political and economic freedom, and for who? For the black slaves that we imported? For the women who worked in the mill towns of New England? Much less for Native Americans? Let's be honest with each other. That is what I'm trying to say. Why do we not hear of a theology? Because our theology would talk about that. Our theology would announce clearly the Founding Fathers are very often nothing but caricatures, cartoons of pompous megalomania, of colonial expansionist white imperialism. They're not wonderful men who sat there in Washington thinking about what would be the best for all of us. They're the kinds of personalities like an Andrew Jackson or a Thomas Jefferson who could understand the necessity of removing my people from the southeastern part of the United States, my homeland, because they wanted to get us out of the way so they could bring more black slaves to plant cotton in Mississippi and in Alabama and in Georgia, and so they could create a buffer between them and the colonial empire of Spain. That's the truth. And when they marched us out of our lands in the 1830s under the Trail of Tears, literally thousands of my ancestors died on that walk through the Ozark Mountains. By the thousands, they froze of exposure. Little women, and children, little babies, they died marching across those mountains. And all under the Founding Fathers, the myth of the Founding Fathers, the brave pioneer, the covered wagon, the whole thing, the cowboy. All of these mythologies that we have are exactly the reverse of what the experience of Native America tells us. Native America is an embarrassment to the myth of the American dream. It is not an American dream for us, it is an American nightmare. We don't enjoy the American dream. We have lived through the nightmare of America, of the colonial expansion and the decimation and genocide of our people, and we need to talk about these things honestly. I think one of the ways that I've tried to say it is that when you cut through all of this kind of stuff and you get down to some kind of a bottom line of what this means, for most Western colonialists, we can talk about an American history, albeit a mythological history. But for most Native people, we cannot talk about an American history. We can only talk about an American Holocaust. And the Holocaust that came to our people is the ground of a Native American people's Christian theology. It is a ground of oppression. It is the ground of suffering. It is a long oral tradition and a memory that goes back for generation after generation that we use as the source material for what we have to say as we look at the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, the trivialization of Native people's experience in our country is one of the reasons you don't hear about a Native people's Christian theology, but there's other reasons closer to home in the life of our churches and for any of us in this room who think of ourselves as being Christian. In terms of religion, one of the reasons it has been trivialized, I think, is also because the Native people's experience has been marginalized in the life of the church because it's not taken seriously, since it doesn't share Western categories. And if it doesn't share Western categories and Western assumptions and Western values and Western traditions and the Western vertical time sense and that whole wonderful pyramid built up by Western Europeans as to what is the right stuff and the real stuff of theological dialogue, then it's not really that relevant. I'll give you an example of what I mean, how in the lives of even of our churches, Indian people and Eskimo people have been largely dismissed and ignored. One way to do this is to talk about some kind of groups of people within the church. Let's begin by talking about Western conservatives and converted Indians. I want you to imagine two circles. I want you to imagine an angled relationship between those two circles of people. In one circle up here, there would be the white conservative Western Christians. They are men and women who believe firmly that Christianity is the white man's religion, that it was brought here as a gift to those of us who were savage primitives that were in darkness, and that it was somehow the cultural captive of the Western experience, and that Jesus in fact was a Swede or a Norwegian or a German or an Englishman, by God, and that kind of understanding, you see what I'm talking about? The conservative equations, watch and listen to these equations carefully. The conservative Western missionary equations were that somehow the church equaled the culture. The culture equaled civilization, and civilization equals competition. There are three primary equations to missionary expansion in North America, and those are the three. The church equals the culture equals civilization, and civilization equals competition. That was the message brought by conservative Westerners to Native American territories, and so what they did was not to convert us religiously, they converted us culturally. To become a Christian, you had to enter into that same matrix, that same equation of Western colonialism. You had to try and become a white man, because the religion belonged to the white man. It was the white man's religion. And what is the aftermath of that kind of angled relationship between conservative Westerners and converted Indians? Well, the aftermath of it is that many Native people are now second-class citizens in the vertical power structures of the institutional Western Church. We are the people who live on the marginal fringes, trivialized by our national church structures. We're given a sop of an Indian Concern Sunday, and yet most of our clergy live on a pittance. Our buildings are falling apart, the roofs leak, we never have enough money to combat the social, economic, and health problems on the reservations. We're trundled out once in a while on special days to make a guest appearance so that we can have a cameo role in the greater pageant of the Western Church, but we are not treated seriously, and nobody talks to us theologically, for God's sake. Nobody takes us seriously theologically, and you've got a bunch of converted Indians sitting at the bottom of the pyramid of the Western power structure that are afraid to talk back because they're afraid that the white man, because it is his religion after all, will turn the tap off, even though it's only dripping out little nickels and dimes to keep them alive, and that's the truth. On the other side, we can talk about circles of the liberal white church. And you can have a circle of liberal whites, and you can put them here, and you can put traditional so-called Native Americans here, and look at the angled relationship there. Liberal whites, the spiritual orphans who feel their culturelessness. They have no culture, and so they go off armed with Black Elk Speaks in one hand and Carlos Castaneda in another to the reservation looking for the real Indians. They bypass Christian Indians. Why? Because after all, Christianity is the white man's religion, and any Indian who would profess to believe in Jesus Christ is sold out. So we've got to go and find a medicine man somewhere out there in the desert to teach us what the real Indians have to say, because we're not, after all, spiritual people. And you romanticize and idealize our people. And you go off hunting for gurus of the prairie to teach you how to love trees and buffaloes. And then what is the response that you get from the traditional Native Americans? You get scorn and hate in return, because they reject your religion of Christianity. Why? Because they have seen the sad history of colonialism in America, and they know, just as all the other people know, Christianity is the white man's religion. And so thousands of young Native Americans abandon the church and leave Christianity in a search for their roots in traditional religion because they don't want anything to do with the white man's religion. I am submitting and suggesting to you that we all participate in this vast mythology, religious mythology, that Christianity is the cultural captive of one group of people. Indian people and Eskimo people participate in it, whether they are the converted Indians at the bottom of the pyramid of the power structure of the white capitalist system, or whether they're angry traditionalists hiding out in the bunkers of tradition on our reservations. Conservative whites and liberal whites participate in it, and we all do a little square dance around and around and around. And everyone in that little dance ignores the voice of Native people who can also claim the liberating power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And what happens? What happens when that voice is not heard? White people remain impotent in the face of their own technocracy. They remain victimized by their own technocracy. They remain spiritually at a loss, either in the conservative circles of racism or in the liberal circles of just social impotence. They can't ever seem to bring about community or peace or justice. They rail against the destruction of the planet. They rail against nuclear arms. They rail against the falling apart of our families, and they don't seem to know what to do about it. And on the Indian side, you have a whole generation, whole generations of spiritual schizophrenics, men and women who believe the dread decision of either or, the dilemma of making a choice in their spiritual lives, that if they wanted to be Christian, they had to walk away from their tradition and perform a kind of self-mutilated spiritual surgery to let themselves walk into the doors of the white church. Or you've got traditional Native people who have run out of the churches and who are also cut off from their Christian brothers and sisters because they believe they can't trust their Christian brothers and sisters because those people are sellouts. And so our tribes and our nations and our families and our communities in Native America are schizophrenic and cut down the middle, and we look at them and wonder why they drink. Are you crazy? Wouldn't you? I would. It's nuts. Of course they drink. Of course there's social unrest. Of course there's complete dismemberment on our urban areas and reservation societies because the people are not whole. The people are divided. They have been cut in two by this ridiculous assumption that Christianity is the white man's religion. It is in the face of this that I come to present a new indigenous Native peoples Christian theology. And I do it for a number of reasons. I don't do it because I think that it's some kind of club that I can use to beat white people over the head with and say it's all your fault. I don't do it because I blame anybody for having killed the buffalo. I don't do it because I just enjoy digging up the dry bones of the past and rubbing our faces in it and reminding us of what a horror story America really has been. I do it because if we don't do it, and if we don't tap the resource of an indigenous theology for North America, none of us, Indian or white or black or Hispanic, male or female, will be able ultimately to succeed in this society. The power and the resource of a Christian people's indigenous theology is the renewing resource for a movement into the 21st century in theology to finally give this country, this nation, this hemisphere, something that it can stand on to build a real, lasting, and meaningful, sane community. That's what an indigenous people's Christian theology is all about. I do it because I am committed to the vision, the prophetic vision, of healing my people, of not allowing that old split between traditional and Christian to falsely divide us anymore, to proclaim openly and publicly that there is an Old Testament of Native America, an Old Testament of God's revelation and powerful acts among our people over centuries that we can stand firmly in, rooted in that tradition, pick up the gospel of Jesus Christ and find that though Jesus as a male was a Jew, that as the risen Christ he is a Choctaw, he is a Kiowa, he is a Lakota, he is a Navajo. There is a liberating power in that for our people, a healing power that can restore the spiritual center and balance to our lives. And there's something else it can do for all of us. It would be the first theology that we would have that would truly be indigenous to North America, that would not necessarily be dependent on Western categories. Now, I've said this, and it is controversial, that even liberation theologies coming out of Central and South America are still, if they follow the Marxist dialectic, dependent on Western categories of philosophy, imported philosophies that grow up out of the European experience, or the colonial experience, or the industrial experience. I'm talking about the tribal experience of indigenous, native, aboriginal people of North America, our Old Testament. It has nothing to do with Western categories of reality, but is a powerful resource for a new theology that complements the gospel of Christ, but renews it and refreshes it in a powerful new way. That's a gift that our people have had for a long time that's never been looked at seriously by any group of people in this hemisphere. Another thing that it can do for us, it can finally give us a community. It can give us a way to talk about community that's never been talked about before. It can give us an opportunity to examine ourselves as being the descendants and the people who have come after those who have almost universally failed to ever create a meaningful community. The American political structure has failed to create community, and the American religious structure has equally failed to create a meaningful sense of community. We have nothing but a patchwork quilt of vested interest groups around this country. We still have a capitalist dominating system which places people on a pecking order of a pyramid structure of power and privilege and prestige and of going for all the gusto and getting all that you can get. We don't have a community. And yet in front of you, you've got those descendants of societies that were absolute experts when it came to creating community. The tribe, I call it the Christian tribe, is what we're talking about. Native Americans can offer a tremendous resource in finally developing a meaningful theology of community. A third thing that Native American Christian theology can do is it can help us weave together threads of solidarity from many of the theologies that all of you sitting in this room share, but in different ways. Some of you think of yourselves as being very engaged in feminist theology. Some of you are concerned about theologies of peace. Others are concerned with human rights. Some of you are concerned with the ecology of the planet. Has it ever struck you that a source theology that would help unite all of those different threads of theological thought in America could be an indigenous theology that is a whole circular theology that has every one of those concerns as being an integral part of it? We could find a common ground of solidarity in unity with indigenous people, not only in this continent, but all those indigenous people I've spoken to around the world, Maoris and Aborigines, the Polynesian people and Laplanders, the people of Africa, the indigenous people of South and Central America. We could have finally a ground to stand on where we could come together in solidarity and no longer be impotent in the face of militarism and consumerism, but join forces and be able to talk with one voice instead of several small voices squeaking in the corners of America, asking for a little more attention and money, if we chose to do it. That is a ground of power. That is a common resource that Native American Christian theology can offer to all of us. Well, I'm going to quit in a minute. I don't know what else I want to say unless I get off into the theology. And I do want to give you a chance to ask me some questions. I feel extremely passionate about this subject. I have, in my experience, and I'll just quit with this one, in my experience, I have in many times not been taken very seriously when I talk this way, and I understand it. There are many non-Indian people who think I'm out of my mind, who still want to pretend that if you're a tribal person, that you are somehow to be marginalized and trivialized. You're not really that important. I have lived in the white power structures, and I know that if I have not jumped through the hoops that white men want you to jump through, that you can be trivialized and not considered that important. I realize that it's very important to many white men as to what school you went to and what degrees you have, to wear like some kind of phallic badges on your chest to prove that you can talk out loud and say things intelligent. I'm also aware that the church is changing and that the hope for the 21st century is before every one of us in this room if we choose to seize the day. The vanguard of the 21st century will be, as the gospel said, those who were last will be first. And Indian people who have long been ignored and forgotten and trivialized will be in that vanguard. And I invite all of you to join us in moving toward a new frontier, a frontier of sanity, of hope, of peace, of reconciliation. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask me? I'm supposed to repeat the question. Question was, one of fact, is the 30 to 35 million North America or is it the whole hemisphere? The studies that I go by would say it was North America. It is very controversial, just as the Bering Straits business is controversial. Who would the indigenous people of Europe be? That's an interesting question because it makes me think of the Bering Strait argument. It's another aspect of trivialization has been the migration theory that we came here from the Bering Straits, so we didn't. And there's a kind of implicit feeling in that whenever you hear that story that, well, they didn't really own this anyway. Do you ever notice how often, always looking for an excuse, any way they can squeeze out of it somehow? Well, you migrated here. A couple of points are fascinating. The latest archaeological finds, the oldest finds, are in South America. Now that's an interesting point, isn't it? The oldest evidence of occupations in South America, not in North America. That's fascinating to me. But be that as it may, let us suppose that we migrated here 40,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago. How many people who claim French extraction could say, well, they're French because they lived there 20,000 years ago? How many Englishmen could say, well, I'm English because we lived here 40,000 years? No, you didn't. Migration was a common fact for all of the tribe of the human beings. So migration is a relatively ridiculous argument in terms of ownership of property or aboriginal right. The aboriginal people then of Europe, I would say, to me, it's not a question of trying to say, well, the Lapps or the Basques must be aboriginal. Yes, they must be, perhaps more so than other migrant peoples that came in. But I think respecting the dignity of a claim of people onto a land, because it was a homeland and because that was where they had settled over generations, would tend to make me say Norwegians are aboriginal. That's fine with me, or Swedes, or French, or Germans. You have to watch that, because one of the tools of capitalism and colonialism is this false debate over who gets to own what, and it is the seed of destruction for any group of people who are trying to communicate with each other. It is the open door to imperialism. And so I'm really cautious about that, and I look at Western Europeans as having every right to claim their aboriginal rights in their homelands. I think you had one.
This is two questions too, but one is just, when I was on the West Coast, I heard a lot more talk about bioregionalism, about people having a political strategy of learning a bit more about where they live and where their resources are as ways of forming community, which to me was a lot more hopeful than going to the church as far as where we might go, say, in the 21st century. Is there talk of that in this area that you know of? And if so, where is it being done, or do you see much hope in that? The other is just, is yours the voice which is heard, Luther-Northwestern, or are you sort of off in a corner somewhere? I know a lot of students who enjoy you, but I'm not sure. Just wonder where the structure sees you.
Okay. He asked me two questions. One, bioregionalism as a strategy for the 21st century, and then how am I doing at Luther-Northwestern? We're very bioregional. The answer in terms of my own theology, and I don't pretend to be an expert in what bioregionalism really means or anything, but I have in this area, in this region, I have seen regionally, say within Native people, a tremendous resource in not what I would call regional kinds of things. I guess you could describe it geographically that way, but tribal theologies emerging. I don't pretend to be the guru in this thing. I'm a voice in the wilderness, really, and my goal is to encourage Navajos to develop a Navajo Christian theology and Sioux to develop a Sioux Christian theology. And I'm not Mr. Indian, and I don't speak for all the people by any means. And I've begun to see that happening. I've been talking a lot in Canada and Alaska, and I see the glimmers of it emerging among the Cree people of the Arctic and among the Eskimo up in northern Alaska. So regionally, I think it's wonderful. Also, when people in what I call pastoral neighborhoods begin to connect, as the native people of the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of Minnesota have now started beginning to connect with the white people of the Diocese of Minnesota, tremendous new things are starting to happen. I wrote a brief paper in which I suggested what our diocese, being an Episcopalian, would look like by the year 2000 if we chose to do it. And I used total non-Western categories of the Native American experience. And the latest thing I heard was a bishop in Australia who had gotten his hands on that paper and who had written to me about it, and a bishop in England, and there are bishops all over the United States who are reading it and talking about it. Now that's a regional model for how we can develop what I call base Christian dioceses. That is simple, regional, humane kinds of relationships that are no longer vertical or angled like the ones I was talking about, but horizontal. When our people are treated seriously, new things begin to happen. And we work well with other people. There's no reason why we can't, and it will change. This diocese will change, and is changing in a wonderful, positive direction. I won't go into all that, it would bore you, but things like parity in clergy salaries, for example, destroying the old pecking order of who's got the biggest church, how many members go to your church, well, I'm better than you are kind of nonsense. give away theologies, to share the wealth of the church with the poor without forming a task force or a budget to do it. That kind of a philosophy. How am I doing at Luther-Northwestern? I don't know. It's a funny thing whenever you're pegged as being a radical, because people always assume then that you're going to be at odds and fighting with everyone around you. And I found, and so I would say, I mean, it'd be a cheap shot to say, well, Luther-Northwestern is a big, staid, conservative, white, Norwegian, Scandinavian institution. And that would be a cheap shot, because it is an institution like Augsburg, or like any of the places any of you work or live, that is struggling either to hold its ground and retrench or to change. And both things are happening simultaneously in our lives, usually in America. You have groups of people who dig their heels in and go into a bunker mentality like Ronald Reagan, who thinks they can hold back the tide of change. And then you have progressive men and women who roll up their sleeves and look forward to a saner world for all of us. There are many sane voices at LNTS that have been supportive and helpful to me, and I deeply appreciate them. I don't think I will be tenured at Luther-Northwestern, but that's never been a concern of mine. Okay, I will. The question is about, what do I mean by an old, I'll summarize his questions for the tape, but the Old Testament of Native America, as I call it. I get asked that a lot, and it's an extremely important question because it can be misunderstood. I'll be honest, I say the Old Testament of Native America because I want to get your attention. And I always succeed when I do that, particularly very strong Christians who are deeply involved in their scriptural tradition and heritage, Lutherans in particular who place very high value on scriptural authority, and Old Testament professors in particular find that statement to be a provocative one. What I mean in a simple way is this. As a Christian, I would say that the primacy of the Hebrew, the canon of the Hebrew Old Testament, is fundamental and primary to our understanding of the new covenant of Christ Jesus, because it was into that cultural and historical and religious experience that God made herself manifest in the person, the physical person of the man Jesus, born into that community at that time. Now then, on the other hand, I would also say, though, that if you take what is an Old Testament, what is the Old Covenant, it is a combination of the stories, the poems, the histories, the memories, the famous people, the revelations, the prophecies of any community or any group of people. And when I collect those of my own people, I find that I can speak then of an Old Testament of my people. Jesus was not born into the Choctaw Nation. He was born in Bethlehem in Judea, not into my nation. But I also have an Old Testament. The ground of my theology then is to stand in the collected tradition and wisdom and values of my own people, and in one hand to have the Hebrew canon in this hand and the New Testament in that hand. When I do that, then both become more clear and meaningful to me, and they begin to reach me where I'm standing. I no longer float up off the ground in a cultural conversion matrix and lose reality with either one. Now, as Jesus came into the Old Testament experience of his own people in his own time, he came to do two things, I would say. One, to confirm that Old Testament. In your hearing today, all of the prophecy this prophecy has been fulfilled kind of statement. He also came to correct that Old Testament. No, do not think that the Sabbath was, made for, or man was made for the Sabbath, human people were made for the Sabbath kind of thing. Came to both confirm and correct. So I would say that as Jesus encounters the native tradition, Jesus also both confirms and corrects our tradition as well. There are many things in our tradition, in our Old Testament, that I feel that the presence of Christ corrects. That I would say as a native person, we used to do it that way, but we no longer will do it that way because the wisdom and power of Christ has taught us otherwise. On the other hand, There are so many other things that Jesus confirms and blesses. And particularly if I were spending a long time talking about Christology as to who Jesus was, totally blesses and confirms many of the cultural traditional values of our people. So I guess my answer is I give primacy to the Hebrew canon and to the gospel of Christ Jesus, of course, as our canonical scripture. But I also claim the right as member of the tribe of the human beings to stand in my own Old Testament and to read both of those documents through my own eyes and my own wisdom, my own tradition, because if I don't do that, then I don't think I could read either one clearly. My concept of God, and because I said she instead of he. All right? That also gets your attention, doesn't it? It's funny, it's so easy to get people's attention. It's really not that hard, is it? I mean, you just say, Old Testament of Native America. Oh, my God, what did he say? She. Whoa, there was another one. My concept of God, I've never had the struggle that seems to plague contemporary West in terms of its understanding of God. I'll give you an example. Our tradition teaches us that all things must be balanced, that the will and the purpose of the Creator was for balance, so that for every, cold thing there is a warm thing, kind of an image, if you will, a yin and yang, though I hate to use the Eastern images, but I hope you see what I mean. There's balance is very important to us. Therefore, if the Creator became incarnate in the physical form of a man, when she returns, she will be incarnate in the physical form of a female. So when Jesus returns, she will come back. And so it's perfect balance. It makes perfect sense that the male and the female would be balanced because the Creator does all things in harmony and balance. Just as we have the equation God is love, in my tradition we'd say God is harmony and cannot do anything out of harmony that would be jarring, rocking, mean, nasty, unbalanced, oppressive to another group. It is a balance. So therefore, I have in my own understanding of the person of God no problem whatsoever in recognizing both the male and female nature of God and also the incarnation of God in a male and female way. I think we'd all be a lot healthier if we'd have just accepted that a long time ago and not make such a big deal out of it and worry so much about it. It's so silly. The balance between, when I pray to the four directions, and then I always acknowledge the direction this way, which is direction to indicate the Father, and a direction this way, which is to indicate the Mother. I also, just as long as we're on that little subject, will give you another example of our theology. I don't believe in the timeline of history in which Christ, they draw it on a blackboard in seminaries and they make a big arrow, big phallic arrow coming down into that line, and they say, and Jesus broke into history. I don't believe that. We have a cyclical sense of time. The first cycle of kinship was the cycle we call the Old Testament. And in that cycle of kinship, according to the theologies of the Southwestern people, for example, their wonderful theology of the emergence, of emerging from the womb of the mother, literally, the Christ came in a male form and emerged naturally into that cycle of kinship. And in so doing, he began a new cycle of kinship we call the New Testament time, and promised us there would be a time when she would return, which would initiate a third cycle of kinship, which we would call the kingdom of God. When she returns, it will not be coming down to break into history. It will be an emergence. And I've often said that many white folks, I think, will be standing there in the second coming, waiting for the rapture, and they'll be looking up like this, saying, "Where is he? Where is he?" And a lot of our people will be going, "Where is she? Where is she? She's coming." And it'll be looking down. She will be born of a mother, again, in a natural way, not a violent way. I'm also asked that. I have been trying to write this down because so many people have asked me to write it down, because so far it's just been me traveling around like some kind of itinerant evangelist, running around ranting and raving at people about this. And I did one time. Because I'm not high on the pecking order, I cannot be a full teacher. I must be an administrator and a teacher. because unless you have a doctorate, you usually get saddled with being both an administrator and a teacher. Your administrative duties excuse their right to give you a chance to teach. That's part of the vertical Western institutional system. So therefore, I'm saddled with two jobs. I also take my family life very seriously. And so I spend a lot of time in childcare, and I don't then sacrifice that just for the greater glory of Steve to write this stuff down. I don't get a lot of time. I did last summer sit in a room, in a dormant room for a week. My wife gave me 1 week to do this, and I did it in a week. I wrote out 10 chapters. This whole thing is written out. But I'm not pleased yet with it because I don't think it makes sense yet. And I'm hoping that I will finish writing it out, and I've got 2 publishers that want to publish it if I'll write it, they said. And it would be done by the end of the spring maybe, or summer if I'm in Canada or something. Otherwise, that's the Christian theology. If you want to read about native tradition, though, and you don't know much about it, I would encourage you to pick up a paperback book called The Sacred by 2 authors, Beck, B-E-C-K, and Walters, W-A-L-T-E-R-S, published by Navajo Community College Press. They're 2 women authors. That's just a paperback book that will take you from soup to nuts on what the traditions of Native America were like. And it'll give you some ground to begin with. I've got it's 1 o'clock.
That the forces that you've talked about that have repressed the emergence of a native theology and church here would be similar in almost all other nations in the world. I'd be interested if you have seen emerging theologies in other indigenous peoples around the world, what, if anything, you've learned in content or in process.
Have I seen other indigenous theologies emerging and how do they relate to ours? Yes, I have. I've had wonderful experiences in dialogue with Aborigines, as I said, from Australia, Maoris from New Zealand, Fiji Islanders, many African people, and people from India in particular. I find that the theology is emerging, say, from more westernized, if you will, societies, say from Japan or Korea, for something like that, although they may be of a different cultural context, tend to have a little more of the Western edge to them sometimes than maybe tribal people. I think the bottom line I'm talking about is a tribal experience. Those of us who have maintained tribalism as a sophisticated way of life. And in that sense, I find that the tribal experience of Africa and of the Pacific Basin region in general, and also don't forget all those indigenous folks down south of the Rio Grande, is fertile ground for the development of these kinds of theologies, and many people are working on that. I think Africa and that gets me into some trouble. But by that I mean I'm not trivializing them, I'm taking them seriously. But I also feel compelled by my own understanding of the gospel to challenge theological systems or structures that I think are wrong or that are oppressive or that are out of whack. And if you're curious, I'll give you an example. I am extremely opposed to what I consider to be the kind of personal salvation theologies of the conservative right in American Christianity. I think those are tremendously wrong in the reading of the gospel of Jesus. This whole emphasis on a personal salvation, bring Jesus into your heart and you'll be saved and then you'll make a good paycheck and you'll go to heaven, breeds the kind of neo-fascist conservatism that leads to an orthodoxy that really is debilitating for a free society. And I'm very opposed to it. And I don't like guys like Jimmy Swaggart, or I don't like the TV preachers. I think that they need to be challenged and called for what they are. They play on the fears and the suspicions and the hatreds of our society. They aid and abet racism and the destruction of the body of Christ, and somebody needs to say it and not pretend that we're going to be nice and say, well, we need the fundamentalists, so let's not call them any bad names. I disagree. I think we ought to stand up and call it for what it is. I feel exactly the same way about the Church of Jesus Christ, the Latter-day Saints. I'm very opposed to Mormonism as a science fiction religion that is wreaking massive destruction on our reservations by stealing Indian children. And as a priest of the church, I'll stand up and say that. A lot of people say, well, you shouldn't say that. Why not? It's true. So I have some very strong opinions. Did you want to ask me something?
No, I do. I have 1,000 questions. I'd like to know more about theology.
Maybe sometime. It's hard. She asked me to like to know more about theology. It's hard to summarize it. That's why I didn't get into it today. It's so big. There's so many things I could tell you. It was like a revelation for me. I've never been a comfortable Christian. I've never been a relaxed Christian, a happy Christian. I've always been a struggling Christian. My spouse says that my patron saint was St. Thomas because I've always, had trouble with it. And my seminary experience was one of the most miserable times of my life. And I've had a heck of a time coming to some sense of peace of mind with all of this. And it was like a revelation for me when I first opened the New Testament and read the temptation of Christ and realized that that was the first vision quest Jesus went on. He went up the hill crying for a vision. And then as I thumbed through it and went quicker, I found the other three. And there were four, the sacred four vision quests of the Messiah. And then I'd always wondered why the heck John the Baptist was in that story anyway. Because he always seemed so goofy. He got it all wrong anyway. So what, except as a nice character in those biblical movies, that gave him an excuse to have the dance of the seven veils and then cut his head off. And other than that, it was a character part. And I never understood it. And then when I began to understand the theology that's both in the Southwest and in the plains of the sacred clown, or what they call among the Lakota people the heoka. The heoka is the contrary, the one who does things backwards, who is intentionally outrageous. Suddenly John jumped out, and it said this man John had a vision of the thunder beings, and he was a heoka. He was the heoka of Christ who stood at the hinge point between the old covenant and the new. And through his outrageous behavior, he showed the people the dark. For when the Messiah comes, he will cleanse his threshing floor, and the chaff will be thrown into unquenchable fire. He painted wonderful images of night and dark and terror and dread for us. So why? So what? So that when the Messiah came, the vision of the brightness of the light of the healing one, the medicine one of God, would be clear for us all to see. And so he was the heoka of Christ. He was the sacred clown. Those kinds of things suddenly began to make sense to me. The vision quests of Jesus, the healing of Jesus, vision, understanding sin is not action, sin is vision, that vision and reality are one and the same. There is no differentiation or distinction between the two. Clear message in the gospel of Jesus Christ that the vertical pyramid is to be replaced by the horizontal tribal community, that the body of Christ is the tribe of Christ. When Jesus said, who are my mother and my brothers? They said, your mother and brothers are standing outside. And he said, who are my mother and my brothers? And he pointed to all of us that were in the room with him that day, and he said, Mitakwe oasen, all my relatives. That's a litany that the Lakota people use constantly that indicates the circle of humanity in which we're all bound in the cycles of kinship. And Jesus literally said, Mitakwe oasen, all my relatives. You are all my relatives. Wonderful imagery and meanings that come out of that New Testament. Those are glimpses of what I mean. That my incarnational theology, there is no such thing as animate and inanimate. It's ridiculous. There is no animate and inanimate. We've been told a myth, and that the second coming will be an incarnation in a feminine form, and it will be a healing process that naturally emerges. It will not be violent or destructive, and that we will not have personal salvation, that longing for a kind of egotistical immortality. We will have corporate salvation or no salvation at all. Where the question is, where do you go from here if you feel some resonance with the tradition of Native people in your own spiritual life? what do you do? I used an image once in the chapel at Luther-Northwestern, and it was an image of what I call Western vacation theology. And by that image I meant many Western people will go on vacations. And when they go on vacation, they go to Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon or the ocean or the mountains or forest or something. And they will come home and they will tell their friends, we were at the Grand Canyon. That's a good example. I was at the Grand Canyon. And I don't know why, but somehow I just felt closer to God. I felt so small, and as I looked at that big, wonderful Grand Canyon, I just felt somehow, I don't know, closer to God. Well, that's funny for an Indian. I mean, kind of, because there's all these people in Bermuda shorts standing there. They're taking pictures of God. They're taking photographs. Here's some slides of God right here. We've got, that's what they're doing, and they don't know it. And yet notice that longing, that resonance, that feeling that's in there. Whatever is in all of us is what I mean by we need to look at each other honestly and horizontally and not romanticize each other any more than I would blame anyone in here who was a white person and say, well, it's all your fault, you're all to blame. No, you're not. You're a human being like I am. We're all human beings. We're all in this together. And so I won't blame you, and don't romanticize me. It's in you as much as it's in me. It's not that Indians are gurus or have a corner on the market. It's not that if you're a white liberal, you have to be a wannabe. I want to be an Indian. I've got to pretend to be an Indian to find the real Indians. You don't have to do that. When you go to that Grand Canyon, the emotion and the feeling that you feel, the presence of the living incarnate God, no animate or inanimate, the living physical presence of the incarnate Creator in her creation. When you look at that Grand Canyon and you make the breakthrough that it's looking back at you and talking to you, when you transcend your own narrow fearfulness that if an animal or a bird or a tree was to speak to you that that's crazy, you know in your heart and in your soul that it's not crazy. You know that in the midst of a forest or by the resounding thunder of an ocean wave, you can clearly hear and sense the presence and the voice of God. And if you simply let go of that, you don't have to become an Indian to do it. You be yourself. And the wonderful thing about the native culture is we reject, as the Messiah rejects, rugged individualism, because that is absolutely, self is absolutely the basis of sin. Instead, we look at individuality and champion individuality. That individual response to your own mother and father, that individual loving childhood response to the Creator is in every human being, and it doesn't matter what tribe you come from. So that native people are not giving you something, like in the old missionary sense, we were in darkness and you gave it to us. Come on. We're not going to reverse that. We're not building new pyramids in the 21st century to say, okay, now we really had the answer, so we're going to give it to you. It's already in you. It is accepting it and releasing it. And that is true, I think, for all of us. If we could learn to do that together and trust one another and allow that kind of diversity, then I think the church would begin to change, which is one reason that I strongly contend that our theological education systems, for example, are woefully behind the times in discouraging heresy. One of the worst places that you can discourage heresy is in a seminary. In the first and second year of seminary is a time when young men and women, or older men and women, who come to seminary for theological education should be encouraged to have any heretical thought that they want, to throw out as far out in their minds as they can, to say the most ridiculous things about God, Jesus, the Bible, as far as they want. And then through the process of peer group discussion and with the help of faculty and people who are older and more wise in the spiritual journey, then they can slowly come back toward the center ground where we find meaningful community. But if you begin your theological education impeding that kind of imagination and creativity, telling people they're not free to really think anything they want to about God, then what you do is you come out with a bunch of very anal retentive automatons who 5 years after they get out into the parish burn out. Because the parish is the great conservative leveler of clergy. It is the place where they don't want heretics and they don't want wild-eyed people. Where does that time come then? Where is the safe space? Where is the safe space for us to have creative, imaginative theologians being born into the life of the church? Our theological seminaries are factories of doctrine and dogma. And we wonder why our churches in the mainstream of Protestantism don't grow. They're boring. That's why they don't grow. They don't give a quick fix like the radical right does, and they don't have the moonbeam theologies of a quick fix that the radical left has. They are dull, and we need not be dull if we'd ever trust each other enough to use our creativity and to think in my class, I say right from the beginning, this is a class that entertains heresy. If you have a heretical thought, please bring it up. Well, I ought to quit because it is getting late. I thank you for your time and patience.